Welcome to Beat Diabetes, and today we're going to talk about the perfect dinner meal. But before we get started or get involved with that, I want to talk a little bit about those events in our lives that have just a temporary inconvenience or distress or problem versus those that have a longer lasting problem or inconvenience. So let's think about toes and feet and ankles. When you stub your toe, usually it hurts for about a minute and then the pain goes away and you get about your day. It's not a long-term problem and you don't remember. If I ask you, when's the last time you stubbed your toe, you probably couldn't recall. On the other hand, there are some things that happen with our feet that have a much longer impact. I remember once I sprained my ankle severely, and I was having problems walking, and I was hobbling around for probably 6 weeks, if I remember. But it was a long-term issue, and even beyond that, my ankle was swollen for some months. So obviously, a stubbed toe is a much better event than a sprained ankle, especially if it's a severe sprain. Now, when it comes to your glucose rises, there's a huge difference between the person who is in absolutely perfect metabolic health, typically will be a young, slim person, versus the diabetic or someone who's getting close to diabetes, who is typically going to be in their 40s or 50s and a bit overweight. So here we go with the young, slim person who is in great metabolic health. They eat meals, and that's what will be represented by these spikes. And those meals spike them up for just a short while, and they don't even go very high. So you eat a meal. Hardly matters what it is, because it doesn't matter whether it's high carb, medium carb, low carb. If you're young and in perfect metabolic health, you can get away with almost anything, and still you'll be down to baseline in about an hour. So here's a person who has some pancakes and sausage for breakfast, up and down, quickly back down to baseline level, probably below 100. This red line would represent 140. He never touches 140 all day long, no matter what he eats. Has a lunch, has a sandwich and some French fries, stays under 140 and is quickly back down to baseline. Same thing with dinner. Below 140, back down to baseline in about an hour, sometimes 45 minutes, and such a person will be right there where they need to be. So these are not long-term events. This spike doesn't last long. It reaches a peak of maybe 130, 125, and boom, back it goes. Good shape. So that's maybe where you were when you were 20. Maybe where I was. I didn't test my glucose when I was 20, so I don't know for sure. Now, here's a person who's diabetic. They eat a meal, and if it's a super high carb meal, it's going to be higher than what this little whiteboard shows. But they eat a meal, and it goes up much higher, goes well past 140 milligrams per deciliter. Not only does it go up too high, it stays up too long, and it barely has a chance to get to baseline. Often will never return to baseline during the day, because by that time you're having a snack or another meal, and here you go up again, and once again you go too high and you stay up too long. And so basically, from the time that you eat your meal, for the next several hours, you're being affected. And in hour 3 after eating, you're still being affected by what happened when you started in on that meal. And the same is true with lunch, and the same is true with dinner. So your meals are having a major effect upon you, and it's not a good effect. Once you go past that red line, which is the danger zone, you're in trouble. And the longer time you spend above that red line, above 140, every day, the more diabetic complications you're going to see. Now, when you have diabetes, the thing that you want really to fix your problems as best as they can be fixed, and they can really be fixed, but the thing you want is to try to imitate that 20-year-old slim fella who has perfect metabolic health. You want to try to imitate him. Now, you can't imitate him perfectly. You may be 300 pounds and you're not as slim as him. And even your blood sugar is not going to be able to perfectly match his, but you can get pretty close. And the way you do that is you have to modify your diet. He doesn't. That 20-year-old, he eats whatever he likes and he's still fine. His meals are short-term glucose rises that don't even go very high. You, on the other hand, have to modify your eating, your lifestyle to try to mimic him, because what we're really after is normalized glucose. That's where there's no complications, or if you already have complications, that's where they will reverse. If you can somehow imitate the 20-year-old in terms of his glucose, no, you won't look as good as that 20-year-old, and you won't run as fast, and your mind may not even think as clearly and sharply as his, but your blood sugar can get mighty close to that 20-year-old by cutting the carbohydrates and doing a few other things. And of course, one of the big things is you cut out breakfast. And you have bulletproof coffee, which is basically coffee with some fat in it, like cream or coconut oil, or cream and coconut oil, or cream and butter. Some coffee with some fat in it. That's your little breakfast. Or if you absolutely have to chew on something, have a couple of boiled eggs. But basically, almost a carb-free breakfast, if you want to even call it a breakfast. And when you do that, you're going to actually do better than the 20-year-old, because the 20-year-old is getting somewhat of a bump. You'll get almost no bump at all. But on today's video, I want to talk about the dinner meal. I believe the dinner meal is especially important because if you eat a high-carb dinner meal, not only will it raise you too high, but once your dinner is over, you're going to have all evening long in what I call the sluggish zone. The sluggish zone. What does that mean? Well, it means that we typically are at our least active lifestyle after dinner. That's when we sit around on the couch and we watch TV and we talk and we don't do much of anything. If we're going to exercise, typically it'll be in the morning or maybe after lunch. But who exercises in the evening? Very few people would. But then it gets even worse, because you go to bed. And if your glucose is still high from your dinner meal, then what it means is once you go to sleep, you're really in the sluggish zone. Your heart slows down, your circulation slows down, everything kind of just creeps to a crawl. And you're not going to process glucose very well at all if it's still up there from dinner. And you're going to have all night long to be struggling while you sleep to try to get your glucose down, and you probably won't make it. And what that means is, in the morning, when you get up and test your blood sugar, and we call that the fasting glucose because you're testing before you've eaten anything, you're going to find that your numbers are higher than usual if you had a high-carb meal. So essentially, you are affecting yourself at dinner time, through the evening, and through your sleeping time, all the way up until the next morning. What goes on in your evening and in your sleeping time is a direct result of what you ate for supper. Especially that's true when you eat a late supper. But even if you eat a moderate supper, it's going to affect your evening, and it quite likely will affect your sleeping time and your fasting glucose. And that's why, in my opinion, the fasting glucose is like a report card that especially tells you how well you did the day before, and specifically during your dinner before. And if you had a high-carb dinner and your body never could bring it back down to baseline, guess what? You'll wake up in the morning, test your glucose, your fasting glucose, and it's going to be too high. It's going to be much higher than it needs to be. On the other hand, if we reverse that, and you have a low-carb dinner meal where your body can process the carbs and any carbs that are there, or better still, have very few carbs, you're going to go through the evening and go through the night with much lower glucose. You're going to wake up and test your blood sugar in the morning, the fasting glucose, and you're going to find you're in better shape. So what that means is, basically, if you're going to eat carbs, and I don't have anything against some light carbs in our diet. I eat carbs. I have soup with okra in it and spinach. Benedict and I have that frequently for lunch. And then I will eat low-carb vegetables here and there, and I eat salads. But typically at dinner is where you want a very low-carb meal to give your body very little carbs and glucose to process during your evening, in that sluggish zone, or in your nighttime where it gets even more sluggish. You know, the nighttime, this sluggish zone is kind of the reverse of what it means when people go for a walk after a meal. They say, well, you eat a meal, but you go for a walk and that'll help. And it will, typically. But what if you ate a meal and took a nap? The exact opposite of the eat a meal, take a walk. Well, typically what's going to happen is you're going to have terrible blood sugar and very little efficient processing of getting that glucose down where it's supposed to be. So the dinner meal is critical. The next 14 hours after you eat, let's say you eat at 6 p.m. and you won't be eating again until 8 a.m. of the next day. That gives you 14 hours that are going to all reflect back on what you ate that dinner. Ergo, the perfect dinner is going to be a lighter dinner. Your lunch should be your bigger meal. Your dinner should be your lesser meal. So it's going to be lighter, and it's going to be low carb to the point where it's either carnivore or almost carnivore. So for my dinner tonight, I'm going to give you an example of a perfect dinner meal. And since it will involve chaffles, let me quickly remind you, how do you make a chaffle? A chaffle is like a waffle, but it is made up of two main ingredients, eggs and shredded cheese. Most people cook their chaffles in a mini-waffle maker. For my recipe, I stir 2 eggs and a half teaspoon of baking powder well, and then add about 1 1/4 cups of shredded cheese. I usually add some almond flour and soy flour and an equal amount of heavy whipping cream, but that's optional and entirely up to you. I add the almond flour and cream because I like the taste, and it does make the eggs go further and makes more chaffles. Plug in your chaffle maker so that it can heat up while you stir everything together. Give it between 4 and 5 minutes and you'll have beautiful golden chaffles that have very few carbs to them, far superior to the typical buns people use for their hamburgers. So this is the good old American hamburger on a bun. And the bun is a chaffle. And since chaffles are mostly cheese and eggs, you're not getting hardly any carbs. Now, as mentioned in the instructional video, I do throw in a little bit of almond flour and soy flour. So it's not a pure carnivore, but it's close. The hamburger is pure carnivore, but hold on, let's think about some of the other toppings. So we've got a bun and a hamburger. Now, this is my style. I always just have one bottom bun. I get my fingers a little dirty that way, a little messy, but I can live with it. Now, I'm not using one bun because I'm afraid that the carbs will be too many. With the chaffle, there's so few carbs, almost none, that I could easily have a top bun. And if it takes one to satisfy your hunger, then, use the bottom and a top. But for me, this is kind of how I do it. Now, a hamburger seems like has to have something kind of over it, some kind of a ketchup or mustard or whatever. But ketchup is out. It's got way too much sugar. So I got a divorce from ketchup a long time ago. 3 choices you could have. One is picante sauce, which is my favorite, and that's the one I use mostly. Another one, if I'm in the mood, is a sugar-free barbecue sauce, and that gives it that barbecue flavor. And you could go with mustard, because mustard has no carbs, almost unless they put some extra sugar, but most mustard does not have carbs, but somehow I've never been in the habit of eating hamburgers with mustard. So I'm going to go with my old favorite tonight, and that is the picante sauce. It's similar to ketchup, but much less carbs than ketchup. We'll just put out a little here. Spread it around, and boom, there we go. And I have a tomato slice. Tomatoes do have some carbs, but a simple slice like this is not going to have many. So I'm going to put the tomato on the hamburger, and then I'm going to put some lettuce on top. So no, this isn't a carnivore meal. A true carnivore would sneer at me for eating this meal. They would laugh. They would mock. But trustfully, you won't do that. Still, very light in carbs and a fairly light meal. Now, if you just say, Dennis, I couldn't even get half filled up with that. I'm used to bigger meals. You could always use 2 hamburger patties. Or like I said, you could have a chaffle on top as well. But this is one of my more common dinner meals, and it works for me. I tested my blood sugar before. It was 98. We'll see where it goes about an hour and 50 minutes after I finish this meal of my hamburger, low-carb style. I tested my blood sugar about an hour and 15 minutes after completing the meal, that hamburger with the chaffle bun and the tomato and the lettuce and the picante sauce. I was at 98 before the meal. I was at 108 an hour and 15 minutes after the meal at the time I should be hitting my peak or somewhere close to that. So a 10-point rise, I will take it. That does not bother me. My goal has never been 0 rise of blood sugar. I think that's unnatural and abnormal. It's just not necessary. So I'll take a 10-point rise, and I've given my body an easy time of it for tonight. When I go to bed, not too much work to do for my body metabolically. That's what we want. When you do this day after day and night after night, basically skip your breakfast apart from some bulletproof coffee, put most of your carbs at your lunchtime, but even then it's a low-carb meal, and then a very low-carb dinner. You're going to win, and your blood sugar levels are going to start going down until they approach that normal 20-year-old slim young man or young woman. So give it a try. Is this the only perfect dinner? No, of course not. There's all kinds of perfect dinners, and that would include bacon and eggs or an omelet. All kinds of perfect dinners. You could take ham and cheese and put it on a chaffle. That'd be a perfect dinner. Lots of perfect dinners, but the perfect dinner is a low-carb dinner and on the light side. God bless. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our uploads page is in the description.